name's Alec. It's the European migration crisis from the humanitarian view, so focusing on the refugee perspective, NGOs, and UNHCR. So a little bit about the graphic you see. I chose like a torn European flag, a European Union flag, because the European migration crisis, we believe that's kind of tearing apart the European Union because the states don't agree on what to do for a solution. So I'm going to offer a couple solutions at the end. One thing to note, I'm going to be referring to migrants kind of as an umbrella term and refugees more specifically. From the humanitarian perspective, they are people first. They shouldn't be like classified as these terms. Those are my group members. So the focus question, how should the European migration crisis be solved? This is the question that I'm going to be addressing throughout the presentation. This is an image of a refugee from Turkey who just kind of has a sign saying, "Don't send me back to Turkey." So why are people fleeing their countries? There are a lot of refugees from countries such as Syria down here that have civil war. So they're being forced out of their countries. They're leaving because of violence and civil war, obviously. There's no safe return, so once they're a refugee, they don't want to return back to their country during a time of crisis. They're also seeking safety, support, and better opportunity. So we believe that European Union countries, it's their duty and their moral obligation to house these refugees and kind of give them a safe place to build their future. At least until maybe like the time of crisis is over. A little bit about timeline. So April 2015, 400 migrants drowned near Libya, another 650 near the south of Italy. That's an image of a ship kind of tipping over. It shows you kind of how drastic it is, how dangerous the trips on the Mediterranean are for these refugees and why they need help. Also, the EU, they couldn't agree on a quota system, so the quota system is kind of dispersing refugees throughout the European Union, and this is why there's a divide. Which brings me to the next slide there. People don't agree on it. The orange countries are less in favor of the quota system, while the blue ones are more in favor. And then finally, EU and Italy, they're looking at the Libyan Coast Guard. The problem here, and NGOs have a problem with it too, because the Libyan Coast Guard is kind of forcing these migrants back to their countries, and a lot of migrants are dying in the process, so they want to protect the migrants. This is kind of showing the route. So a lot of migrants from Turkey, Egypt, Libya, also to the right is Syria, and these are some central locations they go to. 2015, there's a large flow of migrants and refugees, over 65,000 in Italy and Greece, and that's why these countries are kind of panicking about what to do. Some abuses against refugees. So there are makeshift camps, as you see down there, kind of tents. One of our solutions later on is to improve these camps, kind of make them more permanent. I'll talk about that later. Also, a lot of these migrants, kind of like the Turkey border, are getting shot at. So in one incident, 14 were killed, 5 which were children, and 18 were injured. Some abuses against children. So in these camps, there's a lack of health care. They're also below the poverty line, which leads to kind of child, that's weird, which leads to child, there it is, child marriage. Yeah, there we go. And less than 50% of the refugee children, these are like opposite. Anyway, don't have education. That's another thing I'll talk about later. Alright, now it's behind. That's fun. Alright, so moving on to UNHCR. So this is a government organization from the United Nations. United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. So their mission is to protect these refugees throughout this process. So the UNHCR, they want to call upon these European unions to protect the refugees. They also want to help prevent the loss of life at sea because thousands of refugees die every year coming from these countries over the Mediterranean to Europe. They also want European states to put a more efficient asylum system for these asylum seekers. Moving on to some NGOs, they're non-governmental organizations, a little bit different than UNHCR because they're not tied in with the government. So a few of them are Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and Refugee International. They all believe these refugees deserve basic human rights and they're not being treated fairly by these European states. They also encourage asylum for these people, and they want to keep the peace within the European countries because, as you saw from the flag, we think that the European European Union is kind of being torn apart from this issue. A little bit about what should be done. You can see in the quote there, it says, in Libya, it's either death, prison, or Italy. You cannot go back, you cannot turn around. So it's kind of an effective quote just to show why these refugees are leaving and why they need help in the European Union. So basically they can't go back to Libya, and these Libya warships, they're taking migrants back and kind of throwing them in prison. They're not treating them fairly, and NGOs and us as humanitarians, we want to stop this. We want the European nations to work together and figure out ways to keep these migrants in their countries and kind of build them up. So one solution we have is resettlement areas. We want to improve these, make them less temporary, more permanent, kind of build some structures, offer healthcare, kind of offer education. One of the things for education is for children to build up their education so that they can kind of migrate into these European nations, and then they can actually add to the GDP or to the economy by getting jobs. Another one is protecting refugees on the Mediterranean Sea. You see a lot of pictures about these boats tipping over, people drowning, NGOs coming out and saving them. So instead of the European Union going against these refugees and sending them back to their countries, they should be helping these people out in the Mediterranean and kind of bringing them in and housing them and helping them out because they can't go back home. Finally, supporting basic human rights. Every human deserves human rights, and these refugees do not have them back in their home country. So we think it's kind of moral and ethical responsibility of these European Union countries to take in these refugees and house them as their own. We're excited, and thank you very much. Any questions?
Oh, okay. I definitely agree with you about what you said, how it's kind of a responsibility of the European Union, like nations to take care and like of these refugees. How though do you think, like, I kind of see from their perspective that it's hard to be now trying to find funding to support people who weren't there before. How do you think they can do that?
Yeah, so one of the kind of counter arguments that we're like thinking of when we were going through the presentation, with the whole kind of amping up the resettlement camps to take in these extra people, obviously it's gonna there's gonna be more taxpayer dollars, so that's a solution. But the thing with that, I know in my research, Italy was concerned like 13,000 euros it takes to support these resettlement camps, so you could disperse that. Part of the quota system that they need to agree on is to kind of disperse the refugees throughout, so that raising taxpayer dollars here and there, helping these people and not letting humans die. I think the taxpayer dollars, increasing that, kind of outweighs that, and just dispersing the refugees would make the taxes not increase as much, but that would be a solution to that.
Perfect.
Yeah.
I just have a question about, I know how at the beginning you said that you're not going to call them migrants, or that you're not going to discriminate between migrants and refugees. So in your humanitarian like solution, do you think that it should apply to both? Because I was just kind of confused. Does it apply to both the economic migrant to kind of have in the international law's eyes no really good reason to be there?
Yeah, so I think when I said that, it's kind of migrants is the overall term, but like the focus is the refugees. So I think with the economic migrants, they're different than refugees who, because we kind of went through in class what it takes to be a refugee, and I think there should be kind of like a process to figure out, who's refugees, who's economic migrants, because the economic migrants can go back to their countries where the refugees can't. So what I was saying there, I guess, is just kind of like with the whole human rights thing, thinking of them as people first, but like focusing on the refugees, because the economic migrants, obviously, they're just looking for more money, essentially, rather than safety. So.
Good job.
Thank you.